Hi, in this lecture I want to talk about color and especially about color in relationship to photography. We're looking at a traditional color wheel here, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit more detail, especially for those of you who may not have seen or worked with one of these. But before I talk about that, I want to emphasize a couple of rather unusual things about color. The main thing I want to say that a friend of mine told me once, a color instructor, I thought this was great, is color is an event. And I thought that was so striking because we tend to think of color as a thing that exists sort of independently, but really color is something that happens in a specific moment. It is a relationship between the light that falls on a subject, the properties of that subject, and also the perception of the viewer. So the color of the light, the angle of the light, the way that the viewer sees it, what angle they see it at, as well as the surface of the property are all involved in the way that color operates. So there's a way in which color is, well, pretty subjective, very changeable, and a little bit hard to grab hold of. Now, that being said, we're going to pretend like we can nail it down, and we're going to start by working with this color wheel. The color wheel that we use, this is what we call a traditional color wheel that we use in painting, is based on the discoveries of Isaac Newton. He was breaking down the colors of the rainbow and realized that he could lay them in a line and they actually had this close relationship to each other. And then if he sort of torqued them around and made a circle and added violet, he would have this complete color wheel. And these colors have very specific relationships to each other. So you notice, let's just look at this really quickly, and then we're going to go on to some other color wheels. You notice that you have blue, red, and yellow. And you may remember these from your paint box days or from an art class that you've taken as the primary colors. That is, these are the three colors that are capable of mixing every other color in the world. And sure enough, we know that if we mix red and yellow together, we get orange. Red and blue make violet. Blue and yellow make green. And then if we start to mix in between, we get things like yellow, green, yellow, orange, red, orange. And of course, you realize there's all sorts of colors in between here as well. So this is a wonderful representation of color, but you might be thinking, well, yeah, but there's so many colors in the world that don't look exactly like the colors on this wheel. And that is most likely because they are not accounting for what we call the luminosity or the saturation of this color. So let's talk about hue, saturation, and luminosity. So hue refers specifically to where a color is on the color wheel. So we're going to look at this sort of different color wheel that has the same colors, but doesn't, it has a little bit of a different arrangement. So for instance, if we were looking for yellow-orange, we would look between yellow and red, and there's yellow-orange. It sits directly in between yellow and red on the color wheel. And in between that is something which would be sort of orangey yellow, depending on if it's closer here or here, it's more orange or more yellow. And so all we're talking about with hue is at what point does this color sit? Where is it on this circumference? Now, if we're talking about saturation, we're talking about the intensity of a color. And if we sort of reduce the amount of color that's packed into a square inch or a square centimeter, then we desaturate that color. And that's what's going on here in this sort of grayed out area. These are desaturated versions of, for instance, yellow-orange. When you desaturate it, it gets to be sort of a little bit browny or gray-y, right? So we can also suck the color out of it. This is how we get down to neutrals or taupes or other kind of colors like that. We also have to think about the luminosity, and that is the lightness or the darkness. If a color is very light, as up here, it is a very light version of yellow-orange. It still sits here on the color wheel, but it's like a pastel. If we add black, it gets very, very dark. One of our classic examples, and by the way, whenever we're looking at these things on the screen, it's a little bit deceptive. It's really hard to accurately translate colors. You know how hard it is to translate your screen to print. It's the same kind of problem. None of these are exactly accurate. But let's take a look down here at blue. It might give you a better visual example. A very dark blue is what we think of as navy blue. That's a luminosity. We have sort of a Wedgwood blue. That's the desaturated blue. And then a kind of a baby blue, which is the high luminosity. And then just blue, which is just saturated here. So those are very specific properties. And from those properties, as well as the relationship on the color wheel, we get all the colors in the world. Now, there's some traditional ways that we combine colors, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail. But for this one, these are traditional color harmonies. I don't need for you to memorize them. I'm not going to put it on a written test. But I want you to notice that when we're talking about color relationships or color harmonies or color strategies, we're usually talking about the relationship of colors on the color wheel, whether they are far apart from each other, as in up here, or whether they are very close to each other here. Okay? So just keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's talk about the ways that we use color for contrast. One of the ways that we do it is by putting together warm and cool colors. Warm colors, by the way, are colors that are predominantly on the red and orange side of a color wheel. Cool colors are the colors that are on the blue side. And anytime we mix a color from, or we put colors from opposite sides of the color wheels next to each other, we get a certain kind of high contrast. It sets one thing off from the other. So you notice in this Eggleston photo, all of the objects here through the middle, these little dolls, they're very warm. That is, they're all variations of orange and red and even into a little yellow. Some of them are very saturated, some of them are desaturated, some of them are high luminosity, some of them are a darker luminosity, but they're all warm. And on either side of them, we have blue. We have a blue and a kind of a blue-green. And even though all these colors are sort of mid-range, the contrast is really between the warm colors and the cool colors. Same thing here. You notice that these are actually all desaturated colors, but the sky is very, very cool. The sunflowers and the grasses and all of that are very warm. And so even though everything is quite desaturated and the contrast isn't as intense, then we still have the contrast between the warm and the cool. And just a note, this really contributes to the mood of the photo. That is going to be your assignment for this week. A little more example of warm and cool. Notice how with this photographer, the man has very warm hair, red skin, and against the relatively cooler background of the green moss and the blue shirt, his face stands out. His skin also is the lightest in this area, so that really also pops him out from the background. So we want to think about lights and darks, warms and cools. Now let's get into more traditional complementary color harmonies. A complementary color harmony is a color that is opposite each other, two colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So, for example, red and green, which we associate with Christmas. In this Eggleston photo, you see that we have variations of reds. We actually have reds that are quite dark and a little desaturated. We have reds that are lighter and somewhat desaturated, and reds that are one red in this lamp, which is very saturated. Same thing with the greens. We have greens that are, most of the greens are desaturated, but some are light, some are dark, some are in between. And you can tell if you look at this photo, notice how there's this sense of high contrast. The boy in the chair stands out from the chair because he is green and the chair is red, and the other objects as well. So that's complementary. This is another version of complementary with orange and blue. It also has some other colors, some greens that are a little bit more desaturated, so they're not impacting the color as much. But down at the bottom, we have this very intense blue car against this fairly intense orange ground. And notice how very much those two things contrast against each other. This is actually a triadic color harmony. There are, or actually even beyond, notice that there's all sorts of colors. There's blue-green, there's yellow-green, and there's this red up in the corner. And what that does is it makes our eye kind of move around and around and around this image. It's very stimulating, keeps us moving. One thing I love in this photo is looking at this up here, how there's this red up in the upper left-hand corner. And normally, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to put red off on the edge of a photo. What it does here, though, is it sort of tells you, start here, and you have this kid up in the tree who's clearly, looking down and sneaking up a peek at this couple over here. So we actually have this movement down here. It's a very interesting strategy by Alex Webb. Here's another example of complement where you're using sort of variations. We have a blue-green and a blue-violet, and then the red. It's by Eggleston. Here's an example of dominant color. The color red is really the primary element in this very psychological portrait by Alex Soth. The woman in the center, who's a little bit cooler, a little bit softer, is overwhelmed by all of this kind of lurid red all around her in the bar. This is an example of harmonic. In harmonic or analogous color harmony, you'll hear both of them used. There are colors that are closely related to each other on the color wheel, that are next to each other. So our eye can move from one to the other. So we can move from red-orange to yellow-orange, to even into yellow, even up to yellow-green. All of these are close to each other. And it's rather soothing and calming, but also intriguing. The same thing is happening here with the orange, red-orange, and up into yellows and yellow-greens. On the opposite side, you have a scene like this with green and blue-green. And notice that these colors in this Rebecca Norris Webb are all quite subdued. The luminosity is high in some areas, but the saturation is very low almost everywhere. So it's a very subtle photo. Isolated color. In isolated color, you actually have one object or area of the photo that is a distinctly different color, often cool against warm or warm against cool. In this case, there's this square of blue sky against this background of the gold frame and the warm couch and the kind of dull color of her hair and the wall. And our eyes are completely drawn to that odd blue square. In this Richard Misrock photo, he does the same thing. He has a group of colors that are all very saturated and clean on this melted trike and surrounded by this burned out house. This was taken during the Oakland Hill fires of 1988. Here's an example of a Richard Misrock, really extreme example of focused color, not dominant color, isolated color. These little figures that are very warm in a big field of blue, cool ocean really stand out, even though they're tiny. There's another subtler version. The warmth of the portrait, reds and warm greens and oranges against this very sky blue background, very cool and very luminous and light. And of course, this is one of my favorite examples of isolated color. This lady by Eggleston sitting in two analogous color harmonies. Her dress is red and red-violet, and it's all these cool colors. And the couch is exactly the opposite. It's yellow-green, yellow, yellow-orange, and orange, which is, of course, on the warm side of the color wheel. Monochromatic would refer to black and white photos, but also to any photo that is using really just a single color. And it's variations that are saturated, desaturated, dark or light. This is a very simple photo by Uta Barth. It is in color, although it almost appears to be in black and white. A few other examples of this. This is Uta Barth. Here's a yellow photo. All yellow, just with darks and lights, saturation and desaturation. This is a different version, a different idea of that whole idea of monochromatic. This is by Nan Golden, and using her this kind of tungsten overtone, this yellow overtone, everything in the photo seems to be this variations on this color of yellow. This is by William Christenberry. This is kudzu in the south, so entirely green. And Mary Ellen Mark does this very nearly monochromatic color harmony with this picture of a child in the Indian circus. The child is brown, the blanket is brown, the monkeys are brown, the ground and the stones are brown, even the tent in the background. There's bits of other color, but overall this feels monochromatic. We can also, many photographers use neutral areas, parts of colors that are nearly neutral, very light or very dark or very gray, and that actually sets off the colored images in between. So this is Eggleston's refrigerator or freezer. You see how the frozen food is really framed by the neutral color of the ice. Here in Stephen Shore, the red car and the red doors are framed by the neutral parking lot and building and sky. And finally, this photograph by Edward Bertinsky, almost entirely neutrals except for little bits of color that sort of pop up on this building and in the background. So there you have it, a little introduction to color. We're going to have a color discussion and get into more of this, but this is your primary presentation. Please watch it a couple of times if you have a chance and think about these concepts.